Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Language Acquisition 3 session, the role of morphosyntax. We have 3 great talks ready for you to join. And our first presentation will be by Daniel Ozorny on L1, L2 versus L3 transfer, grammatical gender and determiner acquisition in sequential quadrilinguals. So Daniel.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my presentation real quick and that will start us off. I hope you can see my screen, everybody. All right, so, well, formally good evening now. Well, good day for those in the US. My name is Daniel, as has been stated, and I'm going to present on fourth language acquisition. Before I start, I just wanted to get one formality out of the way and note that the research is my own and not sponsored or endorsed by Northwestern, which I'm actually joining in September. Now, without further ado, let's get into the study. So one of the main questions which the L2 and further acquisition fields aim to answer is what is the role of previous languages when acquiring a new one? To lay out the background, I will consider the main tendencies in L3 acquisition field, but before I go there, I want to draw your attention to the term which will pervade all the further discussion, the transfer. The so-called transfer refers to assuming a property from a previous language. To illustrate, a student of English whose first language is Chinese and second is French might assume the article system or the mean to express definiteness or determinacy from French while acquiring English. The boundaries of transfer, i.e., what constitutes a property, are far from clearly defined, but they do offer us a very useful unit of mental grammar, which is transferable from one language to another. Now, the big question I mentioned can be split down further. For example, if we analyze it as take apart the first question with respect to transfer, we might get the two which I want to draw your attention to as well. Firstly, what transfers? And secondly, how does it transfer? Let me consider now the first question in a greater detail. The conceivable options are 5 for quadrilinguals. It is conceivable that L1 is always the main influence, or L2, or L3, or one of the 3, but not all of them, which is shown on the slide with the exclusive disjunction sign. And lastly, that it is, after all the previous languages which influence the subsequent language acquisition. There exist respective models, L1 privileged and L2 status. However, given lack or even absence of relevant research for L4, no theory of L3 being the privileged language emerged. Now, L1P poses that nothing can override the native language, and it is its nativity that gives the L1 the bridle and the reins. This theory extends easily to L4 in this study, claiming that L1 is the main influence for L4. The next up, L2S, poses that while L1 is acquired to the vast degree unconsciously, L2, which is acquired at the later stage, involves an overall higher cognitive level. And L2 argues that this kind of mental acuity during the conscious acquisition process gives L2 a particular factor in L3 acquisition. In this study, extending L2S to L4 might cause some problems, which I will elucidate in the prediction section. Also, I will have come back to the other models, having introduced the notions of wholesale versus partial transfer. Now, I want to emphasize the lack of models involving L3. While the previous studies considered which language would be privileged in L3 acquisition, L1 or L2, this study expands on that. Thus, the novelty of the study is in looking at all 3 previous languages as a potential source of transfer for L4. why should that be the case? Well, quadrilinguals effectively do present a much richer soil to reap from for the multiple cross-linguistic influences and to attempt to understand their impact. If we want to see a privileged influence, we want to look for it amongst many other influences. In this way, L3 acquisition can also serve to resolve some disputes in L3 acquisition. To paraphrase more academic, if there is a language, the grammar of which has a privileged role in the subsequent language acquisition, that language is most easily discernible amidst naturally plenty of other influences, L1, 2, and 3 for L4. And the same principle would apply if somebody would be able to find a homogeneous group of octa, penta, deca, etc. linguals. In this study, I will consider and contrast all the languages involved to make a determination whether there is evidence for a privileged language or whether language learning is, after all, cumulative. Now, speaking about cumulative, let's come back to the second question from the second slide. There is another way to think of transfer, not only asking which language it comes from, but also how it is that it does so. For theories like TPM, which you saw on the slide, there are theories that transfer is always wholesale, like for privileged languages. It's always wholesale since it is a whole grammar of one language which transfers, not parts and bits of it. The other way to think about it is in terms of partial transfer, where all languages can be considered as sources of various properties. Advocating for the wholesale transfer among many models which look at a variety of ways. There are TPM and IHT which look to typology. There is language of community which looks at the social status of language, and there are many more. Advocating for partial transfer, we have models which in their nature all advocate for language learning being cumulative. Examples include CEM, cumulative enhancement, scalpel, LPM, linguistic proximity, etc. Now to the properties considered in this study. Russian and Ukrainian, as fusional languages, mark gender using affixes. It is important to note that unlike in agglutinative or some analytical languages, gender marking is marked together with case, tense, aspect, and other grammatical categories in the same morpheme. So the cues are not morphophonologically distinct. It is one morpheme which has the marking for all that. L1 Russian has 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. L2 Ukrainian has 4 genders, same plus common gender. The nouns of common gender can denote either or both masculine and feminine entities. That's very interesting morphological insight. English language does not have a grammatical gender system. And lastly, French has only 2, masculine and feminine. Feminine can be marked by letter E at the end of nouns and masculine by absence thereof. So much then for grammatical gender. Definiteness. The word determiner in the title of the presentation was actually confined to definiteness, as it is denoted by the definite article, the semantic iota function. The overt article system, while present in English and French, is absent from Ukrainian and Russian. However, I want to stress that it would be a mistake to assume that English article system would transfer to French merely because Slavic languages do not have an overt marking of definiteness. Such an approach reeks of contrastive analysis, which misses out on all of the crucial underlying computational processes. Nonetheless, having analyzed the definiteness as it is expressed in Slavic languages, the conclusion was reached that it is indeed unlikely for Russian or Ukrainian to influence the acquisition process significantly. And thus, I tested only English to French transfer. However, it is immensely important to stress that the grounds for this decision were not based on mere superficial absence of an overt article system. Lastly, the recent studies on gender acquisition were completed by Brown, who, affirming the cumulative nature of language learning, also attributed some of the influence to L2S model, the one which varies the second language. let me concisely state the predictions for this particular study now. The predictions for the models are as follows. For L1P, the influence of L1 should be crucial and override that of any other language. For L2S, which is troublesome to extend to L4, I assumed we shall see the evidence of L2 at least, and L2 shall trump influence of L1 for the very definition of that model. But it is hard to ascertain what the role of L3 will be. L2 might override L3, or the correlation is not really clear. Prediction of TPM is that the language which is the most typologically close to French would transfer, and for this study it would be English. This way, the models are lining up very nicely to advocate for L1, L2, L3 being privileged respectively. Lastly, the CEM and other partial transfer models expect the influence of all languages without a definite pattern or privilege possible to predict. So much for the background now, and let's turn to the study itself. The participants were 22 Ukrainian high schoolers, all of them juniors, with their languages being L1 Russian, L2 Ukrainian, L3 English, and L4 French. They were divided into 3 groups by their mastery of French. Firstly, 7 learners with A0 CFR level of French. CFR is common European framework of references, the leveling which is common through Europe. Secondly, 7 learners with A1 CFR level of French. And thirdly, 8 students with A2 CFR level of French. All of the participants self-reported levels. The teachers also rated them, and all the students were tested in French and in English. For task 1, the 25 stimuli all consisted of 6 syllables and were DPs with either definite or indefinite article. In the example on the screen, the correct form would have been la soleil très brillant and not la soleil, not la soleil, since the noun soleil is masculine in French. Conversely, they were DPs with the nouns, for example, which are masculine in French and Russian, but feminine in Ukrainian. And so that is supposed to give us insight into L2 transfer. At this point, I shall note that I looked for gender concord, not only for gender agreement. There was no testing for correct, incorrect agreement per se, though the mismatch was present in the ungrammatical stimuli. The 25 stimuli for the second task all consisted of complete sentences, each 10 syllables. Each of the stimuli contained a DP headed by a definite article there, like in the given example, je voulais jouer sans les mots du passé. The correct version would have not included the article le before mot du passé. It should be there in English, but it shouldn't be there in French. The scoring. Oh, right. I would like to make it very clear that the participants were tested in L4 French, right? The scoring, typical for grammaticality judgment task, was scores of 0 to 1. In cases where the transfer was detected, the participant got the score of 1 and 0 otherwise. The scores were calculated for each of the following categories of cross-linguistic influence. L1, that is transfer from L1, L2, L1 and 2, and L3. More about this now in a greater detail. L1, exclusive transfer from L1. For example, noun way is masculine in L2, feminine in masculine in L1, sorry, feminine in L2, and feminine in L4. The transfer was detected if the learner judges a stimuli in French language where noun pain was marked as masculine to be grammatical. I also would like to note that per the established guidelines, yes judgments are the ones which are considered to be more informative than no judgments. So this was the road I took. In a similar manner, if a learner found to be grammatical a noun which should have been masculine in French, but was expressed as feminine, it is reasonable to speak of L2 transfer like in this dog situation. It is not confined to the genders. We had a variety of stimuli. If the gender coincided in L1 and 2, and the learner found it grammatical in a French DP where it was actually not grammatical, it was scored as L1 and 2 transfer. Lastly, when the learner attempted to insert an article when it should be in English but should not be in French, L3 transfer was detected. Now to the results. Having calculated the scores for all categories, I also calculated the average detected transfer rate, ADRT. It stands for the average cumulative score for a given category divided by the number of questions. In other words, it is a measure of how much transfer was detected on every level for every given group of learners given out of 1. The results do show that there is indeed solid evidence for transfer from all previous languages. Let's zoom in now. We see on the graph that the learners started out on A0 level with almost everything transferring. The numbers are very close to 1, as in 100% of transfer. As the level increased with their mastery of French, the rate plummeted to roughly 0.1 for L3 transfer, the lowest, right? That might be connected to their mastery of English. 0.18 for L2 transfer, 0.25 for L1 transfer, and 0.3 for L1 and 2 transfer. It is logical that L1 and 2 is the most resistant to erosion transfer because of the coinciding values for gender in L1 and 2. Having saw evidence for the transfer, the next step was to ascertain whether it was indeed level that accounted for the plummeting rates of transfer. So for and ANOVAs were ran with level as independent variable, and they all show significant correlation between level and transfer scores for every category of cross-linguistic influence. However, much more insightful evidence can be shown by MANOVA, which looks into the intercorrelation between the dependent variables and finds how much of the variation in the dependent variables can be accounted for by the dependent variable. In this study, different multivariate tests gave different partial eta squared results. Partial eta squared is precisely the measure which speaks to how much of the variation in transfer is accounted for by the level. The results ranged from 62.5 to 95.4. 62.5 was given by Pillai's trace. And more sensitive Wilkes Lambda and Roy's largest truth showed 82% and 95.4%. They all say that there is a significant proportion, so a lot of the variation is accounted for by the level, but the data can be assumed as significant. Sorry about that. But it will be resolved by the further tests. So MANOVA, together with multivariate tests, gave eigenvalues and roots for the canonical variable, which in and of itself accounted for variation in the rate of transfer. Only one of 2 roots was found significant and said to account for 98% of variation. The other root was not found significant. Thus, it is safe to assume that it is indeed level, which counts for plummeting transfer rate as it should be. Another test was run, as you see, and that was standardized discriminant function coefficients. However, let's sum up and back down to the predictions. So, was a privileged role of L1 detected as predicted by L1P? No, it was not. Was a privileged role of L2 detected as predicted by L2S? No, it was not. Was a privileged role of L3 detected as predicted by TPM? Same again, it was not. Was the cumulative language learning detected as predicted by CEM et al? Yes, it was indeed. To offer conclusive remarks, the study found evidence of all previous languages and of no privileged language amongst the previous languages, thus supporting the partial transfer models. Thus, the insights which L4 acquisition gives can be of great use to L3 acquisition to distinguish and tease apart between different models and help to solve the debate. But these findings are also very valuable standalone findings. Looking into further research, I think this study strongly suggests that there is a need to establish not whether all previous languages influence the subsequent language learning, but rather how it is that they do so. To do so, my follow-up work, which is at the stage of data analysis now, looks at the pure semantic property of the scope of disjunction and negation in L4 German and French. At this point, I would like to acknowledge two people who helped me immensely over the course of this first in this field paper. Megan M. Brown, a PhD student at Boston University, gave me extensive feedback all the way through the preparing this book, and Professor Susan Flynn offered me incredibly insightful feedback on my writing and thinking, which always had me keeping the larger picture of acquisition goals in mind. I am indebted very profoundly to both of them. Please do reach out if you have any questions about the research on my current work. The slides will be available on the website, which you see on the screen soon after the presentation. And now I would gladly answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for interesting talk. So we'll now open up the question session. You can either, you will preferably raise your hand virtually. There's a virtual hand on the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll be able to see you. Or if you prefer, you can also type on chat to ask questions.
Somebody said that, oh, it was a way ago, that the slides, yeah, they will be on the website. So please, I can type the website in the chat as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Here you go. I hope somebody would have some questions. I could have talked about L4 transfer for 10 more minutes.
Well, I can start the question. I was wondering about the L2 versus L3 levels. How do you decide which one is L2 and L3, and the proficiency of the L2 and L3? Would that would probably matter, and how to decide, are
Definitely.
they proficient in L2, right? And on the model, does it talk about the year of acquisition? So how many years do you need to acquire this language for it to be your L2 or L3? So if you can explain that a little bit more, that would be great.
And I think there is a question in the chat which lines up very nicely about sequence of language learning, age, stage on the onset. Yeah, so so the participants, they actually, they had formal instruction in French and English, and instruction of English became instruction of English started way before instruction of French. So it is both level and mastery of English and time of exposure primary to English. So you can assume, you can say that level of English is actually sort of one rank higher on CFR than French. So for those A2, it would be B1 in English, because they had about they had significantly more exposure to English. And that is how I distinguish both onset and level. And there was no case, as far as I can remember, that somebody would be less proficient in English than in French, or would have less level of proficiency in English than in French. That would have, been very questionable to see the results, L3, L4 transfer. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So one of the questions from the attendees was whether you consider the age and the stage of one's life for the onset of language acquisition. So when they started acquiring the language as the onset.
Yeah, so for this, they all were of the same age, and they all, because they had a formal instruction, they all started learning English and French at the same time, like literally. They came to school and they started. So it was a very homogeneous group, which I think contributes to the validity and veridicality of the results I got. But yes, I did.
Yeah. So what age was it? What if you specify?
High
Oh,
school juniors, so they were 17 to 18 years, and
so
their
eight.
exposure, yes,
Yes, sorry.
17 to 18, those all of them were in those, and they started exposure when they were, well, about 11 years ago. They started very slow exposure to English. It did not help them to achieve high proficiency. In the same way, they started exposure to French about 5 years ago, before the test. But I want to say that it was, the level, say, it was almost initial state level of proficiency. Those 5 years are formal instructions, 2 hours, academic hours a week, not all like 30 weeks a year. So the amount of French they were exposed to is actually very sparse. So the 5 years doesn't speak much. The level of proficiency are much more informative in that way, I think.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Alex is whether this seems very tricky work. Is there any way to compare these results to those of participants with various subsets of these languages? So whether these results are clearly accounted for by linguistic transfer rather than random performances. So any other psychological tests
So
or
about different various subsets of these languages, I think that is about sort of bidirectional work, and whether I would have, for example, acquisition of French then English. It gets tricky with quadrilinguals because it's not easy to find a group of quadrilinguals, particularly with different subsets of languages. I would definitely look over. So the follow-up work, I tried to test, I ran some statistic tests to find that it's not random, to try to ascertain that it's not random. I'm not reporting on that now, but I tried as much as I could to exclude that, right? In the instruction they received, there were some sort of stimuli which said, please don't put the random stuff. So I did what I could. It would be very interesting to look at the sort of different languages of different subsets of these languages. I'm reaching out to my colleagues in Kazakhstan and other sort of post-Soviet countries, which also study lots of languages. They have Russian, Kazakh, then English and French or German, things like that. I'm also running a study with German instead of French right now. And so trying to ascertain that. So the lack of linguistic variation and testing these assumptions, the results against a wider array of languages is definitely something which we should look into.
yes, Alex clarified a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, right. Comparing quadrilinguals to trilinguals. Yeah, so the results, and again, this speaks to the theories of third language acquisition. They are consistent with some models, not consistent with other models. There has not been much research on these subsets of languages for trilinguals, unfortunately. For bilinguals, it's sort of hard to tease apart Russian, Ukrainian, and none that I'm aware of. But given the current debate, these findings are supported by some in L3 acquisition, yes, CEM, but not supported by some other ones. So it's again, it's sort of fishy to use an informal word. Did I answer the question after a bit better after the clarification? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have about a minute. So if you have a very quick question to ask, this is your time to do it. If not,
Probably
thank you,
not.
Daniel.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you,
it was a
Daniel.
pleasure. Okay.
Yeah, and he has his website shared on chat. So please, his slides will be up there after the presentation. Okay. Great. Now we will move on to our second presentation. It's called Emergence of Structured Morphosyntactic Variation in Preschool Children. Dr. Hannah Forsyth and Grant Kemp will be presenting.
Hi, everybody. I'm Grant Rogers-Kem. I'm pleased to be presenting today with my collaborator, Dr. Hannah Forsyth, on the emergence of structured morphosyntactic variation in preschool children. And so up till now, sociolinguistic research has mainly focused on how adults respond to social and linguistic pressures on language variation. And one of the field's main findings is that adults exhibit something called structured variation. And so what this means is that regular patterns of variation are conditioned in a similar way throughout the community. And so um, one example being TD deletion in one community might be conditioned on something like a linguistically or a language internal factor, like the lexical item being used, but another community might condition this TD deletion on a social or like a language external factor like gender. It's also possible that both communities might use both of these constraints in TD deletion, but they might rank them differently as well. Now, more recently, there's been this interest in children learning or acquiring structured variation. And the fact is that structured variation can't continue to exist unless it's been adopted by new members of the speech community. So the question is just how young are these new members when they adopt patterns of their community, and how do they learn what those patterns are at all? How is that structured variation learned? And so we're going to be looking at subject pronoun expression in Spanish, and we'll address both of these questions. The first really remains the same. When is the structured variation learned? How early do children acquire subject pronoun expression in Spanish? But the second question here is a lot more involved as it is right now. So instead, we're going to be asking a related question. In what order do children acquire the constraints on SPE? And so to that end, the talk will look a little bit like this. We're going to go through what subject pronoun expression looks like, what is it, just a sort of general description of the variable, what we do and what we don't know about the order of acquisition on the constraints involved in SPE. We'll present our hypotheses on what we think the full order of acquired constraints are or could be. We'll talk about some of our findings, our results, and then we'll wrap up with a discussion of what it means for acquisition of morphosyntactic variation and more generally. And so subject pronouns in Spanish are expressed either in null or overt form. So here in this first example, we have Juan le pega a Pedro y después él se va or después se va. So Juan hits Pedro and then he leaves, or Juan hits Pedro and then null subject leaves. Now, we're going to take a look at this graph across the Spanish-speaking world. There's a lot of diversity in overt pronoun expression. So communities in the Caribbean tend to have higher rates of overt SPE, while communities on the mainland or on the Iberian Peninsula tend to favor the null form. What they have in common, though, is this set of constraints that they use to condition the variable. So the first of those constraints I'd like to talk about is reference. And so we break this down into same reference versus switch reference. Same reference being a pronoun referring to an antecedent in the subject position two or more times, where switch reference is a pronoun that refers to anything else, whether that's Pedro here in complement position, or perhaps a new individual in the discourse. And the important takeaway is that same reference tends to favor null forms, whereas switch reference, shown here in this darker purple, clearly across dialects favors overt forms. Now, reference is not the only grammatical constraint at play in this. This is a sample taken from Mexico City Spanish, showing that constraints such as person and number can clearly favor overt forms, such as in the first person singular, third person singular here. And from the same study, we see that co-preterite forms, when assessing tense, aspect, and mood, can also favor overt forms. Now, there are also non-grammatical constraints on subject pronoun expression, and these can look like gender or education, age, genre, and these social or stylistic constraints are significant, but they are not necessarily as consistently present across dialects of Spanish, like the grammatical constraints are. Now, in this presentation, we're interested in which constraints children use to condition the variation between null and overt subjects. So how do children acquire variable SPE constraints? But first we need to ask, how do children acquire non-variable constraints? And this is because we need to separate out the variation that we're interested in, this null versus overt subject form, from variation that's simply caused by processing issues or by incomplete acquisition of categorical parts of grammar. And so talking about this, one of the things that makes subject pronoun expression tricky to study in a variable context is that even in non-variable contexts, children go through a stage of variability. So in languages like English or German, where subjects are sort of categorically overt, except in sort of specifically defined circumstances, children go through a null subject stage or null subject phase in which they variably omit subjects, even though that's not part of their target grammar to have that sort of variation. Now, some have also argued that Spanish and Catalan have a null subject stage, and this is because children produce only null subjects for a period of time, and even after they begin producing their first overt subjects at around age 2, they continue to produce pretty low numbers of overt pronouns in particular. So when children speaking English or German are leaving out these pronouns or using null subjects, we know that this is because of this null subject phase they're going through. But in Spanish, we'd like to ask, is it because they're still in that null subject phase, or is it because of something that's naturally variable in their grammar?
Okay, thank you, Grant. Let me start my video here. All right, so just to reiterate, when we go to study children's subject pronoun expression in Spanish, we are going to want to be very careful about what types of variation we attribute to children having a truly variable grammar, as opposed to them simply being in this temporary null subject stage where they just lack the grammatical or processing resources that would allow them to produce overt subjects as consistently as adults do. So one indication that children have a variable grammar is if you can, if that variability has systematicity to it. That is, can you characterize it as structured variation? And there is some evidence that children acquiring Mexican Spanish do structure their subject pronoun expression, at least by ages 6 and up. So Shin 2016 shows that children ages 6 to 7 condition SPE, subject pronoun expression, on the factors of person and number, reference, and the verb type of the verb that the pronoun is the subject of. And these are all conditioning factors used by adults in that same community. Children a little bit older use those factors in addition to the factor of the tense, mood, or aspect of the verb in question. And then children a little older than that additionally use the clause type in which the subject pronoun appears. So this seems to suggest that there is a regular order in which these constraints are acquired. And an additional reference here further suggests that person and number and reference are themselves acquired earlier than verb type. This leaves us with a tantalizingly almost complete picture of the order of acquisition for these language internal constraints on SPE in Mexican Spanish. So what we'd like to do today is establish the full ordering and ask in Mexican Spanish do children acquire the constraint of reference earliest or the constraint of person and number earliest? And there's good reasons to believe that either order is possible. So on the one hand, argument from universality might say that you'd expect reference to be acquired earlier because it is just one instantiation of a language universal tendency by which more reduced referring expressions tend to pick out more salient uh, reference, or in the opposite direction, the more and more explicit forms you use. So going from a null pronoun to an overt one to a demonstrative and then all the way up to a completely explicit name. You do that as you refer to less and less salient reference. Perhaps these references are new to the discourse and haven't been mentioned, or perhaps they've been mentioned but not in a prominent position. So the way reference fits into this larger pattern is that the null pronoun, the more reduced form, is associated with more salient antecedents. It's associated with an antecedent that was recently mentioned in a prominent position, the immediately preceding subject antecedent. Whereas all other antecedent types, whether they're in a less prominent position or completely new to the discourse, are associated with the more robust form, the overt pronoun. And there's also empirical evidence to suggest from other languages that this larger universal pattern is something children are sensitive to quite early, by around age 2. So that is the argument in favor of reference being acquired early. But you might also expect that person and number could potentially be acquired maybe even earlier, because it is the stronger of the two constraints. So looking across dialects of Spanish, the typical ranking of factors is for person and number to be the strongest factor, the highest ranked of all the factors, followed by reference, and then TMA and other factors in various orders. So if statistical strength is what drives acquisition, then we might expect person and number first. But to resolve this issue, we are going to need to look at children who are younger than the ones that have been studied up to date. So the data we will show to you is from children who are under the age of 6, which was the beginning age at which Shin, the youngest age that Shin has data for. Our children are, the data is taken from the Schmidt-Miller corpus of parent-child interactions, which were recorded in Mexico City, Mexico, originally in 2008. And the data we show you is from 19 parent-child dyads who were recruited from 2 different schools. One from a private school, one group, from a private school serving middle-class families, and one from a public school serving working-class families. And the children ranged in age from 2 years, 5 months at the very youngest, to 5 years, up to 11 months at the oldest. So we initially coded all of the animate subjects produced by the parents and children, including the pronouns, but also demonstratives and noun phrases and names. And then we took the null and overt pronouns and coded them for person and number, the tense, mood, and aspect. And then we coded the reference of those pronouns that were preceded by at least one other subject in the same speaker's turn. The idea here was that we're dealing with potentially really young children. So as a first pass, we'd like to just look at those reference chains that occur within a single speaker's turn without having to worry about the complications that happen when you are switching across different speakers. Looking at the distribution of all animate subjects initially, impressionistically, it seems like children, who are shown here to the left, and then parents, who are shown on the right, have pretty similar distributions of the various forms. And when we statistically analyze the proportion of overt subjects overall, we find no significant difference between adults and children. Zooming in on just the pronominal subjects, we find that the middle class children produce significantly more overt subject pronouns than their parents, while for working class children, there is no difference. So, in other words, children produce as many, if not more, overt pronouns than the target grammar seems to call for. Finally, slicing up these proportions by individual child age, we see that children adhere pretty closely to their parents' proportion of overt subject pronouns. And there is indeed no effect of age or of MLU, which is an alternate way to measure development. Since the children in our sample produce at least as many overt subjects and at least as many pronouns and don't seem to change these proportions as they get older, we can confidently say that the children in our sample at least are done with the null subject phase. And whatever variability we see in their subject pronoun expression can safely be attributed to them having a variable grammar. The next question to ask is, which constraints are active in this variable grammar? This figure shows the constraints that are active in the target grammar, that is among adults. Each of the color-coded shapes represents a different factor, and if a shape is to the left of this dotted line, it indicates that that level of the factor favors a null pronoun, whereas to the right, it favors an overt pronoun. So switch reference, for example, here favors an overt pronoun in the sense that switch reference contexts are more likely to result in an overt subject pronoun relative to same reference contexts. And here, same reference is not on the graph because it was used as the reference level against which to compare the others. It's the baseline level. So going on to the factor of person, the baseline reference level was third singular, and we can see that first person singular and second person singular were significantly more likely to result in an overt pronoun than that baseline, whereas the first person plural was less likely to result in an overt pronoun, so it favors the null pronoun. There's no shape on here corresponding to third person plural, and that's because it was not statistically different from the baseline third person singular. And then finally, for the factor of tense mood aspect, the preterite was no different from baseline, and baseline in this case was just a catch-all category of anything other than these three levels. And the levels of imperfect and present both favored an overt pronoun relative to reference. And those are those 3 points right there. Okay, so comparing across the different factors, we see that first person singular has the biggest single effect insofar as its odds ratio is the farthest away from 1. And then the factor of person as a whole has the biggest range across its levels. So this replicates what we see in other varieties of Spanish, insofar as person and number is the highest ranked factor, followed by the others. So if statistical strength is what drives the order of acquisition, then we'd expect for the children in our sample that the youngest ones would at least condition their subject pronoun expression on person and number, especially first person singular, which had the strongest effect of all. And that is precisely what this graph shows. So here at the top, we see the significant effects for the youngest eight children who are aged 2 years 5 months to 3 years 8 months. And for them, the first person singular favored an overt pronoun significantly more than the baseline third person singular. And that was the only significant effect. For the next youngest 5 children, all 3 factors were significant. So the switch reference level favored overt pronouns more than same reference, like adults, and all levels of the person number factor differed significantly from the baseline. And then for tense mood aspect, present tense more strongly favored an overt pronoun than the baseline. And then finally, for the oldest children, six of them, all three factors, again, had a significant effect on their likelihood of an overt subject pronoun. But for the factor of person, here it was only first and second person singular that were significantly different from baseline, not all four. And then for the factor of TMA, a tense mood aspect, it was actually the imperfect rather than the present that was significantly different from baseline. So here, as far as our hypotheses are concerned, here we have a clear winner. Children's subject pronoun expression is conditioned by the factor of person and number at an earlier age than it is conditioned by the factor of reference. But there are a few remaining questions. First of all, why didn't we see any evidence that children acquire reference before tense mood and aspect? Well, this could also have a statistical reason for it. Namely, they have similar strength in the input. So if you compare the odds ratio of switch reference to the odds ratio of the two levels of TMA here, they have roughly the same effect. So the ranking of factors is really more like this, with person and number being the strongest and reference and tense mood or aspect being both in second place. And that matches the order of acquisition we observe in the children. So to wrap up, I wanted to just quickly take a look at how children develop the full-blown pattern of each level within each of these three factors. So with the factor of reference, what this graph does is split up children's proportion of overt subject pronouns between same reference, which is shown in light purple, and switch reference contexts, which is shown in dark purple. And as you can see, adults distinguish between the two. The youngest children do not, and then the middle and older children do. But what you can see furthermore in this more detailed view is that the reason the youngest children don't distinguish between these two contexts is because they're overproducing overt pronouns in the same reference context, as opposed to underproducing them in the switch reference context. So incidentally, this bolsters our confidence, again, that these children are well outside of the null subject phase, because they're in fact overproducing overt pronouns, not underproducing them. Here we have the same outcome variable, the proportion of overt subject pronouns, but now split up by person and number. And just to remind you, the leftmost bars here, the third person singular, that serves as the baseline level against which we compare all the other levels. And I will now dim out those levels that turned out not to be significantly different from that baseline level. So what we see if we compare the overall shape of the distribution within each of the age groups is that the oldest children are actually the least adult-like in the sense that they are flipping the ranking between the second person singular in this light blue and the first person singular in this dark blue, unlike the adults for whom the first person singular has the highest bar. So what this suggests is that even if this factor is, even if children begin acquiring it very early, that knowledge may be not completely stable. So what we have here might be a case of U-shaped acquisition in which children start out strong and then apparently seem to regress temporarily and then become fully adult-like by the end. So going back to our original research questions, we now happily have some answers from our investigation of SPE in Spanish. As far as when structured variation is acquired, we have found or have argued that children in our sample have a variable grammar, and that variable grammar allows them to condition SPE on the factor of person and number by about age 2.5. As for how exactly they acquire that structured variation, we've been able to show that the order of acquisition, in this case, matches the factor ranking in children's input, which suggests that the statistical strength of a factor plays an important role in determining how quickly children learn a given factor. We should be careful to point out, though, that this doesn't necessarily eliminate or completely rule out the possibility that language universality also plays an important role. It just demonstrates the importance of statistical strength. And it also may or may not play a role in how children acquire language external constraints on SPE, which we didn't look at here. In conclusion, we hope to have convinced you that studying children's sociolinguistic competence is interesting and worthwhile, and perhaps even surprised you with how early that competence begins to develop. Thank you very much for listening to us, and also thank you to our collaborators and funders. And we're looking forward to hearing what questions you may have. Thanks.
Great. So we have about 4 minutes. So I'll open up the question now. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand virtually using the raise hand button, or yes, ask a Q&A. Yeah, I use chat or Q&A session here. We have 2 questions on Q&A. Hannah, can you see the questions? Oh, you are muted. Let me.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi, Cynthia. Oh, oopsie. Sorry. Lynn asked the question first. What do you base your age group to the 3 age groups? That was the only justification.
So you might have gotten cut off
yes.
a little bit. So can
Oh,
you?
sorry.
Yeah, or maybe only for me, but can you maybe tell us one more time?
Sure. Yeah, this is why we pre-recorded. My internet is unstable. So we based our justification of age groups simply on trying to get a roughly equal number of participants and tokens in each group. That was our rationale. Great. And then for Cynthia's question, just wanted to say hi. One thing she wondered before is how, or whether it's possible, to tell the difference between kids pick up on the strongest constraints first and data are noisy, and our statistics only pick the strongest constraints out of the noise. Is that a justifiable concern? I think it is. Or are there things that can help us make this distinction? I have had the exact same question myself, and it looks like Cynthia left. I don't see her anymore here. Oh, no, she is here. Okay, great. So I guess I'd ask the question back at you, like, please help. But yeah, it is something I am concerned about. So one way I think to address the problem is to look at kids not only in situations like we have here where adults and children are speaking to each other and possibly priming each other, but to also look at data like from Shin where the children are speaking just telling stories. So they're more on their own. And so their production has to be conditioned. Well, you could make the assumption more safely that their production is conditioned on the grammar that they have internalized, as opposed to simply being primed in the moment by the statistical distributions they're observing at the time. So in the interest of time, that's all I'm going to say for now. And I'm going to go on to the next question. That's very surprising about the overusage of overt forms in the switch reference contexts for the youngest groups, in same reference contexts, actually. Yes, it is surprising. Was there anything different? Oopsies. Was there anything different about these forms compared to forms in the same switch reference contexts or at other ages? I don't know. I'd have to look into it. So
Okay,
it's,
so
yeah.
yeah, so although there are two more questions here, we due to the limited time, we will move on to the next next presentation.
And I'll just type my answers in the chat then.
Great. Yes, that would be great. Thank you, our wonderful presenters, and we'll move on to our third presentation. Yes, the title of our last presentation would be Morphosyntactic Variation is Preserved, Not Regularized when an Optimal Form is Rare. Dr. Katie Schuler will present now. We cannot hear you yet.
Hi there. Sorry, everybody.
Yes.
My internet went out for a minute. Are we good now? Can you see and hear everything?
Yes, we're good now.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
So as was said, I'm Katie Schuler, and today I'm going to tell you about some work that I've been doing with a grad student in my lab, Yiren Chen, at the University of Pennsylvania, called Morphosyntactic Variation is Preserved, Not Regularized when an Optional Form is Rare. Let's see if I can make this work. So I wanted to start by taking a step back and just talk about the big picture a little bit. So there is a very famous quote by many very prominent linguists, especially sociolinguists, who've said that not all variability and heterogeneity in language structure involve change, but all change involve variability and heterogeneity. So just to parse this a little for you, what it's basically saying is if there's change, there's definitely been variation, or there still is variation. But if we observe variation in a language, it doesn't necessarily entail change. So sometimes variants are stable. So my lab is a child language lab. So we think about this question from the position of acquisition. And another place we observe this same distinction between stable variation and changing variation is in child language behavior. So specifically, it's really well known that children will regularize language. They'll change a language when they encounter unpredictable variation. So some of the research on this, for example, if they're exposed to a Pidgin or a Creole language, they tend to change the language, make it more regular. If they're learning from late learning adults, this can happen. And a bunch of experiments, both in natural language and in artificial languages, have shown that when children see unpredictable variation or are exposed to unpredictable variation in their input, they regularize that variation and change the language. However, as we just learned, and other really important findings in the literature have shown that children also learn and match sociolinguistic variation. So in this case, they don't change the variation. Some examples, we just heard about some. We also saw examples of TD deletion, for example. Lots of people have shown that children master these sorts of constraints actually surprisingly early. There are other examples like word final S-lenition. All sorts of evidence is piling up from developmental sociolinguistics, suggesting that kids actually learn and match variation in these contexts. So in my lab, we're asking really two main questions that are sort of the same question under it all. The first is, why do children sometimes regularize variation and other times learn it? How come sometimes they treat the variation like it's noise and other times they treat it like an important part of the dialect? I know there's a lot of you I see in the audience who we've had this conversation, so I know some of you agree. But I think this is also asking a very similar, if not the same question as, how come some variants are stable and others are targets of change? So I like to use kids as a window into this aspect, or adults doing regularization in the lab to try to understand what's happening. So what I typically do is look at differences in the input between these two distinct literatures. So there's the literature on sociolinguistics, which is very strong and I think is true. And there's also the literature on regularization, which I believe is equally strong and also true. So what I've done here is just listed the things my lab considers or is looking in the differences in the input. So for example, if we think about the variation in the community, in developmental sociolinguistics, the variation in the community is often shared by everyone. But in the regularization literature, we're often talking about more noisy variation. So Pidgin or Creole languages, young languages, non-native speakers. In those cases, maybe we'd expect the variation in the community to be more different from each other. The conditioning environment is another target. So when we talk about sociolinguistic variation, we often talk about probabilistic variation. So the variation is predictable, it's conditioned on something. It's not deterministic, but it's more likely in certain contexts than others. And especially in the experimental work on regularization, by design, the conditioning environment is unpredictable. So there's that difference that could play a role. Another is speaker fluency. So in sociolinguistic variation, in the sorts of things we're talking about, the speakers are typically very highly fluent, especially the child's input. But in the regularization case, often we're talking about speakers who are not native speakers. So Pidgin or Creole learning speakers, for example, or in the cases of children learning from, deaf children learning from late learning parents. So their speaker fluency might be less likely. If you're interested in that one, a student of mine is giving a talk on Sunday about exactly that. But today I'm going to focus on the form of the variance. So when we look at what is happening in sociolinguistic regularization or sociolinguistic data or in the variance that we see, often the form of the variance is optionality. And I think some of you are going to disagree with me on this, so I'm going to talk a little about more why I think this. And in the regularization literature, we almost exclusively discuss alternating forms. So we have two overt forms that are varying. So what do I mean by the form of the stable variance? Or can I convince you that maybe optionality is important? So this first started as just an observation I had. So I was coming from the regularization literature and I wanted to learn more about the sociolinguistic literature, and I was sort of collecting different types of variation, different variants that exist and how children acquire them. And I noticed that they seem to have something in common. They all look like a null form and an overt form, or a reduced form and a full form. So for example, in phonological variation, what I seemed to keep finding is various kinds of deletion or lenition. TD deletion is a really popular example. Ing and in variation, S lenition. There's a whole bunch of examples like this where we end up with this variable that's a deletion or a lenited version. And if we look at morphosyntactic variation, which is where I typically spend most of my time, it also seems like this to me. It looks like various kinds of presence versus absence. So presence or absence of a morpheme, for example. So I'm just going to give a couple of different examples. Presence or lack of agreement, so agree or fail to agree, is another popular kind of variation in morphosyntax that seems to be persistent, using we was for we were, for example, or two overt forms varying. So here, every time I talk about this, people give me examples of two overt forms varying that are stable. And so I'm not here to say that I think that this is exclusively true, that like every single stable variant is definitely an overt form and a null form. But the ones that I've collected also feel a little bit like presence absence to me. They're not quite the same as two truly overt forms to me. So here's just a couple of different examples of two forms that folks have offered up as two overt forms varying. So beyond just my hunch and my observation, there's been a recent paper that's evaluated this more formally. So in this work, it's called Optional and Alternating Case Marking, Typology, and Diachrony. So this is a study that noticed the same thing about optional argument marking. So here they argue that optional marking systems are typologically more common than alternating. So tons of languages have optional argument marking, optional plural marking, differential object marking is super common. but it's a lot less common to have differential argument marking that has two overt forms, two alternating forms. So here I'm just zooming in a little bit on the table in this paper. So they looked at optional A is optional argument marking, optional O is optional object marking. And what they found is optional marking is not rare when you look across a bunch of languages in natural language typology. It's super common to have either one of these. But when they looked for alternating argument marking or alternating object marking, they're both kind of rare. So I felt a little more emboldened by the recent work that this maybe is something worth investigating. So let me just summarize before I show you the new experiments, what I'm proposing here. So what I've said is that we all agree that morphological systems containing unconditioned variation often evolve. They often become more regular over time. But not all variation like this is regularized. Sometimes variation can be stable. And optional marking systems are common, and they don't appear to always undergo this kind of rapid regularization or evolution over time. Sometimes they stick around for a really long time. They persist and they're stable. So while it could be that, and it probably is true, that there are social or grammatical contexts that are licensing these probabilistic variants in these systems, what we're proposing is that optionality itself plays a role. So in experiment 1, we wanted to investigate this with a psycholinguistic experiment. So we want to ask whether a variable plural marking system with one optional form is more stable than one that has two alternating forms. And we're quantifying more stable here as more likely to be regularized. So this is what I just said. So is an optional plural marking system more stable than one that has two alternating forms in an experimental context? What we did here is expose 60 participants. We used prolific, sort of like Mechanical Turk, if you're familiar with that. And we exposed them to one of 3 language conditions. So we had an optional condition. So in the optional condition, singular forms are unmarked and plural forms are marked optionally. So they're marked with this ka morpheme, or they're unmarked. In the alternating condition, singular is also unmarked, and plural has 2 alternating overt forms, ka and po, 2 very distinct alternating overt forms. And then just in case, we also created a control condition that we call alternating same as singular, where we have a singular form that's the same as one of the alternating forms. So let me tell you a little more detail about the language we used and the task. So during exposure, participants are going to see singular and plural images. So 1 cow or 2 cows, for example. They see 3 singular and 9 plural for each of these 6 nouns. And then they hear the corresponding sentence, so they're listening to it. The sentence will either be singular or plural. Sentences are constructed with a verb. It's an artificial verb. It just means there is or there are. A noun, these nouns are randomly assigned to the items for each person, and then a plural marker. And then which plural marker occurs depends on the condition I just described. So just to clarify what's happening, it looks like this. For singular forms, in the optional condition, they'll hear gentif mog, for example. In the plural, they'll hear one of these 2 sentences, either the unmarked or the marked. And then the alternating condition has 2 overt forms for the plural marker. And the alternating same as singular has the singular form is the same as one of the alternating plurals. Okay, so after these 72 exposure trials, and after they hear the sentence, we ask them to click a button which one they just heard so we can be sure that they're listening. So after this, they see 18 plural images. There's 3 for each noun, and we ask them to select which of the 2 possible plural sentences is the best one. Which one is best? Which one describes the picture? So for the optional case, the 2 forms would be the unmarked or the overtly marked form. And in the alternating conditions, they can choose between the marked with po or marked with ka. So to remind you, what we're predicting here is that the optional marking should be more stable. Participants in the experiment should regularize, they should change the language in the alternating conditions. So if that's the case, when we plot their use of ka, the more likely plural marked form, this dashed line is showing the presence of ka in their input. So we expect the alternating folks to be using it more than that. So I just told you the prediction. So here's the results. Exactly the opposite of what I predicted. So what happened here so here's the presence of ka in the input. In both alternating cases, people are using both forms. They're selecting both forms. And the mean is landing right on the input probability, which is not uncommon for adults in experiments like this. But curiously, the optional form folks actually regularized more. So they used the ka form on every single trial, opposite of what I predicted. So what's going on here? Well, maybe it has something to do with the frequency of the optional form. So persistent variable forms seem to appear more rarely in their optional contexts. Rates of language change have been argued to slow down when forms get really sparse. So what we wanted to do in a second experiment is ask, like, maybe we just have the optional form is too frequent, and if we make it really rare, then it will be less likely to be regularized. So we ran another 40 adults. And then this time, the optional frequent condition is identical to the optional condition before. We just rebranded it and called it frequent. So ka is more frequent. And then we also created an optional rare condition where the optional form is heard more rarely. So most of the plural forms are actually unmarked. So what we predict here is that optional marking used rarely will be more stable, so the participants will regularize less there. And that turned out to be exactly what happened. So we replicated the optional condition. That's good because it means it worked exactly the same in this version. But in the optional rare case, people were less likely to regularize. They chose between both the null unmarked form and the marked form. So with the last few minutes, hopefully my slides will move on. I want to talk about why this could be the case. So I hope this figure isn't too much. One possibility is just that any rare overt form, anytime there's a rare overt form, variants are more stable and they resist regularization. So what I'm showing you here is the input for the alternating conditions, the optional frequent condition, and the optional rare condition. And I'm showing the null is this transparent one, ka, the most frequent form, is the dark blue, and then po is the light blue. So when you have this rarely occurring overt form, which happened in the alternating conditions and in the overt rare condition, people seem to resist regularizing. So it could be that just a rarely occurring overt form is what's causing people to not regularize in those cases. And this could be true, but this doesn't actually explain the fact that null marking is being treated differently. So the null marker, the unmarked plural sentence, also occurs really rarely here in the optional frequent case. So for some reason, null form is treated very differently than an overt form. There's something different about the two. Oops, I was hoping these would come in one at a time, but they didn't. So what I've been thinking about here, we don't have a final answer, but the possibilities we're considering are that null forms are treated differently by language learners. And we think this makes a lot of sense and might be necessary or advantageous from a learning perspective. So let me just unpack it a little more. If we think about what the interpretations for two alternating forms could be, we really have two things. I'm sure there's some of you will tell me there's more. That's probably true, so I'll be listening in the question section. But it could be two realizations of the same morpheme, or we could have two different morphemes, two distinct words. And that's really all they could be. But if we think about what null could be, when we have optional forms, null can actually be a lot of things in a language. So it could be, for example, it could be not expressed in the syntax. So my language doesn't do this. Nouns don't take a plural feature. It could be that it's expressed in the syntax, but it doesn't happen to be occurring here. So we do this, we're just not, we're marked for plural, but we only do it sometimes. It could be just like in the alternating forms, it could just be a null allomorph. It could be that it it's an overt morpheme, but it's not phonologically present in this case, or it could be phonologically present but neutralized. So the point is that null could be a bunch of things, and it might be helpful for the learner to not commit to what null is, or to take more time to figure out what null means, or to treat it differently than they do overt forms when they're learning. Okay, so that's the same thing I just said. So to finish up, I'll just conclude by saying psycholinguistic studies, I think, need to focus on not just what leads languages to change, but also on what leads to their stability. We think that null forms might play a really important role in stable variation, and that the stability might be derived from the fact that null can represent many things, which leads the learner to evaluate this sort of variation differently than when two forms are overt. And one question that we're really interested in pursuing in the future is whether learners actually come, whether babies come like wired up to presuppose that null means many things, maybe it's just inherent to null, or whether it's something they actually learn from their experience with the language, that null can mean a lot of things and represents a lot of different things. And if it's the latter case, if they need to learn this, how they actually manage to do that from their language input and how they manage to do it so quickly. So thanks everybody. I just want to give a special thanks to a couple people, especially the Taminga and Embeck labs, for their very helpful comments, especially in shaping the way I think about null and variation in general, and also to Laurel McKenzie, who was really helpful in talking about the kinds of morphosyntactic variation that exist in sociolinguistics. So thanks, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you for the talk. It was very informative and great. So as previous, you can ask chat using the Q&A comment, or you can virtually raise your hand and we can see you, and you can vocalize your question as well. So we have one question on Q&A board, and Katie can.
Great, can I just go ahead and?
Yeah,
okay.
You can maybe
so this question,
read the question, yeah.
So this question says that in some of the prior work on regularization, Carla Hudson-Cam and Newport's work, that present absent is one of the concerns is memory. So if the person forgets the marker, then it surfaces as absent, and that might be contributing here. I think it might, in this specific case, it might not be, because our test phase exposes both markers. So you don't have to generate it from memory, you actually just pick between the two. So you're offered up both, and you get to choose which one. So I think if I would have thought exactly this if I hadn't done it that way, but because I did, I don't think it can be that. And also, hi, David. Okay, so the next question, ooh, they bounce around. Wondering whether you predict the relation between over and null to also vary with respect to the meaning of each of the variants. For example, in this case, I guess singular is null, it's also stronger meaning, but you have weaker meaning for the plural. That's a really, really interesting question. I think probably you're right about this. I have not investigated this in any way, but I think it's probably really important going forward to think about these sorts of things. Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true, and we should consider it. This is not exactly what you're asking, but we've also considered like that we don't have another way of expressing plural, but if we did, that might change things as well. So if we had some sort of like quantifier or numeral present as well, and the plural marker was just some sort of number agreement, we might see a difference too. So I think there's a bunch of ways that we could manipulate the strength of the different variants. That's a great point.
Yes. Any other? Sarah Phillips has a question. I will. Yeah, I can. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I actually have a question about maybe potential predictions. So if we imagine that in the psycholinguistics literature, if you commit to a wrong form, it could lead to some type of cost. Do you think that children would also maybe exhibit these kinds of costs if they commit to the wrong form, if it's null? So if there's a absent form and they make the wrong commitment to whether it's singular or plural, would we see them try to correct themselves or maybe do some type of other behavior that we might see in adults, or would you make a different set of predictions?
I think that that's a very fair thing to say. I think that that probably would happen, and I hadn't thought about that. I've only recently started thinking about like a window into what kids might do, but I think you're hitting on like a great way to actually ask about whether null and an overt form are similar or different to the kids, whether they would behave in the same way. So I think probably yes, but what I guess I'm trying to argue is that there's more ways in which they could be wrong about null. So there's not just a couple of ways they could interpret. There's a whole bunch of different things. So I'd have to think more about how to exactly get it at precisely that. But I think you're absolutely right that would happen.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have one more question on the Q&A board.
So I see that some surface variants can be generated by more than one underlying process. Spanish plural absence can arise from either phonological S deletion or from syntactic non-agreement. Is there a way to distinguish such cases? I don't know. I think that that's exactly right, and I totally agree. That might be, I don't think that I captured that in my list of things a null could be, but it could also be this thing that you're mentioning. So is there a way to distinguish such cases in regularization acquisition? It's very hard. So I don't want to say no because I don't want to give up and say that that's not possible, but it's very difficult to determine whether or not what a child is doing when they say null. So it could be that they haven't learned the rule, so they're just omitting, they're dropping it, and kids do that all the time. When they haven't learned a rule, they just leave it off. It could be that they have misunderstood, that they're not agreeing, that they're doing some phonological process. So I imagine there's some experimental way to get at this, but I don't think in the next couple minutes I'll think of it. But I definitely am going to write this down and think more about how one would do that, because I think that's also a really interesting window into exactly this question.
Yes, we have one more by David Ruskin.
It looked like the 33 caught and 67 null showed boosting to 50%. Was it a significant boost? Do you think there may be different mechanisms behind the boosting of null or overt forms? Yes. So these sorts of experiments are so difficult to judge exactly what's going on, because the participant can only give us the probabilities that we offer. So we give them a certain number of trials with a certain number of items and a certain number of nouns. So within those constraints, there's only certain probabilities they can actually hit. So I often am hesitant to commit to saying whether something is 50% versus 55% or whatever. So I do think it was significantly boosted. So I have other figures that where we analyze like entropy or mutual information, like whether they condition on noun or something. And they do show a little bit of change in entropy from the input level. So they are, in all cases, they are changing it a little bit. But it's a tiny bit, and I wouldn't be 100% committed to saying whether that's like a task effect, because they only have so many things that they can, only so many trials and only so many probabilities they can hit, or if it's truly that they are doing a significant boost to the language. So yeah, that's a great question, but I don't know. Then the second part was, do you think maybe different mechanisms behind boosting of null or overt? I'm not sure. So I think that they're definitely handling null differently in their learning. I'm not sure if there's some different underlying mechanism for boosting it or no. We didn't see a lot of boosting of the null form in general. It was mostly boosting overt. But yeah, I'll have to think more about that, because I'm not sure that I'd want to posit a different mechanism, but I think that they're handling null differently, at least in their learning of it. Okay.
Okay, we have about a minute left, and
Sure.
there are two more. Yeah, or no, we don't have we're out of time.
Okay.
So what we can do is there are two more questions. So maybe you can talk to them individually after
Sure.
it. Yeah. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
everybody. Yeah. I am not 100% sure what happens after we finish.
I think we just leave. There should be a different session starting about this time, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm about to go ahead and end the session.
So thank you, presenters. It was nice.
Sure. I think
listening
there's
to
one
you.
more question left in the chat for Katie. But
Yeah. So maybe what you can do is you can type the answer, or
I just
email
took a
the person.
screenshot of them. I hope that that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and then send them the
Okay.
answers by email or one or the other way. That would be great.
Thank you, everybody. Great presentations, everybody.
yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.